Good evening, friends. Tonight, we'll drift slowly into the shadowed corridors of ancient Rome, where marble gleamed under oil lamps and whispers carried secrets that could topple empires. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your part of the world? Perhaps it's late, and the house has fallen quiet around you. Perhaps you're tucked beneath soft blankets, feeling the weight of the day finally begin to lift from your shoulders. Dim your lights if you haven't already. Rest your head on your pillow and allow your breathing to soften, to deepen, to find its own natural rhythm. Tonight, we'll explore a story that history has almost forgotten, a tale of power and pleasure, of midnight feasts and secret chambers, of an emperor whose name echoes faintly through the centuries like footsteps in an empty hall. If this peaceful journey helps you unwind, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right to you. But for now, simply close your eyes and let the story carry you away. Let me share with you the story of a man who was, in many ways, larger than life itself. Maximinus Thrax, they called him. Maximinus the Thracian. Born somewhere around the year 173 in the rough borderlands of the empire, far from the perfumed gardens of Rome, in a place where survival meant strength and strength meant everything. Imagine, if you will, a child growing impossibly tall in a world where most men barely reached 5.5 feet. Ancient sources tell us he stood over 8 feet tall, though we might take such claims with a grain of that precious Roman salt, the kind they harvested from coastal flats and traded across the Mediterranean. There's something comforting about beginning a story with food, isn't there? So let me tell you about the honey cakes that Maximinus might have eaten as a soldier. Those simple rounds of wheat flour mixed with honey and sesame seeds, baked until golden and served warm from communal ovens. Roman soldiers carried these on long marches, wrapped in cloth, a sweet reminder of home. Honey was sacred to the Romans, you see. They believed it fell from the heavens as dew and was gathered by bees who were touched by the gods. In 173, the year of Maximinus's birth, honey cost about 2 denarii per amphora in most provinces, affordable enough for common soldiers but still precious enough to savor slowly. Maximinus began his life as a shepherd, tending flocks in the Thracian hills where wolves howled at night and the wind carried the scent of wild thyme. Can you imagine the loneliness of those nights? The vast darkness punctuated only by stars and the soft bleating of sheep? He learned to fight because he had to, because the world was hard and unforgiving. His size became his advantage, his fists like hammers, his reach impossible for normal men to counter. The story goes that he caught the attention of Emperor Septimius Severus during military games, wrestling matches held to entertain the troops and identify promising fighters. Maximinus supposedly defeated 16 opponents in a single day, one after another, barely breaking a sweat. Whether this is true or embellished doesn't really matter now, does it? What matters is that it could have been true, that men believed it was true, and belief shapes history as surely as fact. Picture him standing before the emperor, dirt on his massive shoulders, breathing steady while smaller men lay exhausted around him. Septimius Severus, a man who understood power intimately, looked at this giant and saw potential. Not refinement, not culture, not the polished education of the senatorial class, but raw, undeniable force. And so Maximinus was recruited into the imperial cavalry, given armor specially made to fit his extraordinary frame, and set upon a path that would lead him, improbably, impossibly, to the throne itself. Let me tell you about the food he might have eaten during those early military years, the savory porridge called pulse that sustained Roman legions for centuries. Made from emmer wheat or barley, cooked slowly with water or broth, sometimes enriched with a bit of lard or olive oil, occasionally studded with chickpeas or lentils. It was humble food, peasant food, but filling and nourishing. Soldiers ate it from wooden bowls around campfires, joking and gambling and telling stories of battles past. In the year 200, when Maximinus was a young soldier of perhaps 27, military rations were standardized across the empire, approximately 3 pounds of grain per day per soldier, enough to make pulse twice daily with leftovers for bread. The years passed as they do, seasons turning, campaigns fought in Germania and along the Danube, promotions earned through blood and competence. Maximinus had no formal education. He could barely read, some sources claim, though he understood Greek and Latin and several barbarian dialects. He had a gift for languages, the kind of practical intelligence that comes from necessity rather than study. While patrician youths recited Virgil in marble courtyards, Maximinus learned to speak by negotiating with tribal chiefs and intimidating deserters. By the time Alexander Severus became emperor in 222, Maximinus had risen to command entire legions. He was a soldier's soldier, loved by his troops for his fairness, his courage, his willingness to endure the same hardships they faced. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. He refused to ride in a litter like other commanders, instead walking or riding horseback for miles, his enormous height making him visible across entire encampments. His presence was reassuring, a literal giant among men, proof that strength could triumph over birth and breeding. But Rome itself, that great glittering city at the heart of the empire, remained foreign to him. He'd visited rarely, uncomfortable among the senators who whispered behind their hands, among the poets and philosophers who measured worth in words rather than deeds. There's something almost tragic about it, isn't there? A man who would become emperor, who would wear the purple and command the known world, never quite belonging to the culture he was meant to represent. And then there were the nights, the long nights in military camps when fires burned low and wine flowed freely. Roman soldiers drank pasca, a mixture of sour wine and water, sometimes flavored with herbs. It was refreshing and safe, safer than water from uncertain sources, and slightly intoxicating after enough cups. Maximinus drank with his men, shared their rations, listened to their complaints. This was his world, not the Senate chambers, not the elaborate dinner parties where peacock tongues and dormouse in honey were served on silver platters. Speaking of unusual foods, let me share a curious detail about Roman military rations. Soldiers were sometimes issued garum, that fermented fish sauce the Romans loved so obsessively. Made from the intestines of small fish, salted and left to ferment in the sun for months, it smelled powerfully pungent but tasted complex and savory, full of umami depth. A single amphora of premium garum from Hispania could cost up to 500 denarii in the early 3rd century, more expensive than wine, more precious than olive oil. But the military version was cheaper, cruder, made from local fish, and every soldier carried a small flask to flavor his bland pulse. Maximinus probably acquired a taste for it during his early campaigns, that sharp, salty intensity cutting through the monotony of grain porridge. The year 235 brought change, sudden and violent as a summer storm. Emperor Alexander Severus, young and dominated by his mother Julia Mamaea, proved unpopular with the frontier legions. He was seen as weak, too willing to negotiate with Germanic tribes, too controlled by civilian advisors who'd never felt the bite of a barbarian sword. The soldiers grumbled. Grumbling turned to anger. Anger turned to mutiny. And Maximinus, the giant from Thrace, found himself at the center of forces beyond any one man's control. Allow your breathing to deepen now, to slow, as we prepare to follow this improbable emperor into the heart of power. As your body relaxes deeper, let the story carry you onward into the secret nights that await in the chapters ahead. There's something comforting about this part of the story, in a strange way. Not because of what happened, but because of how human it all was. Emperors like to imagine themselves as chosen by the gods, marked by destiny, but Maximinus's path to power was accidental, almost reluctant. It began on a cold spring morning in 235, somewhere along the Rhine frontier, where the 7th Legion was encamped in muddy fields that smelled of horse dung and cook fires. Picture the scene with me now. Morning mist rising from the river, soldiers emerging from leather tents, breath visible in the chill air. Alexander Severus was there with his mother, that formidable woman who'd controlled her son's reigns so completely that men joked the empire had a female emperor in all but name. The troops were supposed to be preparing for a campaign against the Alemanni, a Germanic confederation that had been raiding Roman territories. But something felt wrong that morning. A tension in the air like the pressure before a thunderstorm. Let me tell you about the breakfast that might have been served in the imperial tent that morning. Soft white bread made from the finest wheat, baked fresh by the emperor's personal bakers who traveled with the court. Fresh goat cheese from local farms, creamy and mild, spread thick on the warm bread. Perhaps some dried figs imported from Egypt or Syria, plump and sweet, their sugar crystals crunching between the teeth. And wine, of course, watered and spiced with cinnamon, a rare luxury that cost 20 denarii per pound in 235, imported along trade routes that stretched all the way to distant kingdoms most Romans couldn't locate on a map. But Maximinus wasn't eating in the imperial tent. He was with his soldiers, breaking his fast on hard bread and cheese, the simple rations of common troops. He'd risen through the ranks by being one of them, and he knew instinctively that his power came not from birthright but from the loyalty of men who'd followed him through cold rivers and bloody skirmishes. The mutiny, when it came, was swift and brutal. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting, though it's dark. Assassinations in the Roman military often happened during the quiet hours, when guards were drowsy and commanders vulnerable. A group of soldiers burst into Alexander Severus's quarters while he was still in his sleeping tunic. They killed him and his mother together, stabbing repeatedly, offering no trial, no formal accusation, just the swift violence of men who decided their emperor was inadequate. Then they came for Maximinus, not to kill him, but to crown him. Imagine his surprise, soldiers surrounding him, not with weapons drawn but with shields raised, shouting his name, proclaiming him Imperator, Emperor, Augustus, master of the Roman world. He supposedly refused at first, genuinely reluctant, understanding perhaps that power seized by soldiers could be lost the same way. But armies are terrible forces of nature, unstoppable once set in motion, and Maximinus was swept up in that current whether he willed it or not. Let me share with you what happened in the hours after his acclamation. While his coronation was being formalized, while messengers were dispatched to Rome with news that would shock the Senate and terrify the aristocracy, Maximinus sat in what had been Alexander's command tent. The personal effects of the dead emperor were still scattered around, scrolls of poetry, fine tunics embroidered with gold thread, little luxuries that spoke of a gentler, more cultured world than Maximinus had ever inhabited. There was food there too, remnants of the imperial household's provisions. Oysters preserved in salt from the coastal beds of Britannia, delicate and briny, considered supreme delicacies by Roman gourmands. Each oyster would have cost about 2 sesterces in 235, affordable for wealthy families but still special enough to mark celebrations. The Romans believed oysters increased vigor and vitality, made men more potent, though this was likely wishful thinking rather than biological fact. Still, emperors consumed them by the dozen during elaborate feasts, swallowed raw with a squeeze of citron or a dash of wine vinegar. Did Maximinus eat those oysters? The sources don't tell us, but I imagine he might have tried one, curious about this food he'd heard about but never tasted. Perhaps he found it strange, too slippery, too redolent of the sea. Perhaps he pushed the platter aside and called for something familiar, something real, the kind of food that felt honest in his mouth. What he did do, immediately and decisively, was secure the loyalty of the legions. He doubled the soldiers' pay, a staggering expense that would strain the imperial treasury, but by him the devotion of every fighting man along the frontier. In 235, a legionary earned approximately 300 denarii per year. Maximinus raised that to 600, making military service suddenly lucrative enough to attract recruits from across the empire. It was brilliant and dangerous, a solution that created as many problems as it solved, but it worked. The armies loved him. Rome itself was another matter. The Senate, that ancient body of aristocratic families who traced their lineage back centuries, was horrified. An emperor who couldn't properly read Greek philosophy? A man whose accent was thick with Thracian gutturals? Whose hands were calloused from weapons rather than soft from holding pens? Unthinkable, unacceptable, but also undeniable, because he commanded the legions, and in the end, military force determined everything. Let me tell you about a particular food that became associated with Maximinus during his reign, though probably more through rumor than reality. The Romans whispered that he ate entire roasted boars at a single sitting, drinking gallons of wine, his appetites as enormous as his frame. A whole boar, roasted on a spit over oak coals, basted with honey and wine, sprinkled with ground pepper imported from India at ruinous cost. Pepper was extraordinarily expensive in the 3rd century, about 4 denarii per pound even for common quality, and the finest Malabar pepper could cost 10 times that. But it was essential for Roman cuisine, considered worth its weight in gold, literally used as currency during times of crisis. Whether Maximinus actually consumed such quantities is doubtful. The human stomach has limits, even one belonging to an 8-foot giant. But the rumors served a purpose, painting him as barbaric, excessive, fundamentally uncivilized. The aristocracy needed to see him this way, needed to maintain their sense of superiority even as they bowed to his power. It's easier to obey a tyrant you can look down upon than one you must admire. His first years as emperor were spent almost entirely on campaign. He never went to Rome, never entered the city whose purple he wore, never made the traditional sacrifices at the temple of Jupiter or addressed the Senate from the rostra. Instead, he stayed with his armies, fighting Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube, pushing back invasions, securing borders that had grown dangerously porous. And his soldiers loved him for it, loved that their emperor understood military life because he lived it himself. The nights in those military camps were probably the happiest of his reign, if we can call them happy. Firelight flickering on leather tents, men singing old campaign songs, dice games for small stakes, the camaraderie that comes from shared danger. Maximinus would walk among the tents, speaking with soldiers, remembering names, asking about families back home. This was his court, more real to him than any marble palace. And there was pleasure in it too, though not the refined pleasures Rome expected of its emperors. No elaborate pantomimes or recitations of verse, no philosophical debates or literary salons. But there was simple, honest enjoyment in a meal well earned, in wine shared with loyal men, in the satisfaction of a battle won and borders held. There was also, undoubtedly, the pleasures of power itself, the knowledge that his word was law across territories so vast a man could ride for months without leaving Roman lands. Allow your mind to float gently now, as we prepare to follow Maximinus deeper into his reign. The fire crackles low in the military camp, guards change watch with quiet efficiency, and somewhere an owl calls across the darkness. As your breathing slows and deepens, Let the story carry you forward into the complexities and corruptions that power inevitably brings. You might find this next part of our story soothingly interesting in its quiet tragedy. Imagine being Emperor of Rome and never seeing Rome. It's like being given the key to a magnificent house but choosing to sleep in the garden shed instead. Except Maximinus didn't choose it exactly. Circumstances and temperament conspired to keep him away from the city that was supposedly the center of his world. Let me share with you what Rome was like in the year 235, when Maximinus took power. Picture a city of perhaps 1,000,000 souls, maybe more, crowded into neighborhoods that climbed the 7 hills like ivy on ancient walls. The Tiber River, flowing brown and sluggish through the heart of it all, spanned by stone bridges where merchants hawked everything from African ivory to Baltic amber. The Forum bustling with advocates and philosophers, the Colosseum hosting games that grew increasingly expensive and desperate as the empire's finances strained. The smell of the city must have been overwhelming, a mixture of humanity, cooking food, incense from temples, smoke from fires, sewage from the great Cloaca Maxima that drained waste into the river. And the food, oh, the variety of food available in Rome to those who could afford it. Let me tell you about the sweet wine cakes called dulcia domestica that were popular in aristocratic households during this period. Made from the finest white flour, soaked in milk until soft, fried in olive oil until golden, then drizzled with honey and sprinkled with ground pepper. Yes, pepper on dessert, that Roman touch of using spice to enhance sweetness. The recipe comes down to us from Apicius, that famous cookbook that preserved so many Roman culinary traditions. In 235, the honey alone for such cakes cost about 1 denarius per pint, and the olive oil another denarius, making these treats affordable only for wealthy families. The poor ate their sweets made with grape must and cheaper oils, satisfying but nowhere near as refined. But Maximinus wasn't in Rome enjoying such delicacies. He was on the frontier, eating soldiers' rations, planning campaigns, dealing with the endless logistical challenges of keeping armies fed and equipped. The military supply system was remarkably sophisticated, a network of granaries and depots stretching across the provinces, but it required constant attention. Grain had to be purchased or requisitioned from farms, transported in heavy wagons over roads that turned to mud in spring, stored in warehouses that needed guarding against theft and vermin. His wife, Caecilia Paulina, we know almost nothing about her personally, but she must have been extraordinary in her own way. To be married to such a man, to bear his children, to manage an imperial household while following the army from camp to camp instead of residing in comfortable Roman palaces. Their son, Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, was made Caesar, designated heir, given his own military commands while still barely more than a boy. There's something touching about Maximinus's desire to establish a dynasty, this giant from nowhere wanting to create a legacy, wanting his son to inherit what he'd seized. Let me tell you about a savory dish that might have graced their table during quieter moments. when the imperial family dined in relative privacy within their campaign headquarters. Menudo marinum, a seafood stew documented in period sources, made with whatever fish were available, cooked in wine and broth with leeks and herbs, thickened with breadcrumbs, seasoned with the ubiquitous garum. Even on the frontier, preserved seafood could be obtained, carried in amphorae from coastal areas, kept edible through salt and careful storage. A practical dish, nourishing and flavorful, the kind of meal that satisfied without being ostentatious. But back in Rome, the Senate grew increasingly resentful. Maximinus demanded more taxes to pay for his military spending, sending officials to collect with threats and violence. Estates were confiscated on flimsy pretexts, wealthy families accused of conspiracy to justify seizing their assets. The imperial treasury was bleeding gold to pay soldier bonuses and campaign expenses, and Maximinus solved the problem through what amounted to state-sponsored robbery. It was effective but not sustainable, and every senator he impoverished became a potential enemy. There's a particular detail from this period that I find oddly compelling. Maximinus supposedly sent orders to Rome demanding that all gold and silver ornaments be stripped from temples and melted down for coinage. Sacred vessels, statues of gods, centuries-old dedicatory offerings, all to be reduced to raw metal and stamped with his image. The Senate was appalled. The people were frightened. Even many soldiers felt uneasy about such sacrilege. But Maximinus was desperate for funds, and desperate men make dangerous decisions. During this time, there was one unusual food item that became a strange symbol of imperial extravagance and the disconnect between Rome and its emperor: flamingo tongues. Yes, those long-legged pink birds that fed in shallow waters across the empire's southern reaches. Roman gourmands prized their tongues as delicacies, claiming they possessed a unique flavor, subtle and refined. Hundreds of flamingos would be killed to harvest enough tongues for a single banquet, each tiny morsel costing perhaps 5 denarii in 236. The waste was staggering, the cruelty casual, and it became emblematic of Rome's decadence at a time when frontier soldiers were dying to protect borders against barbarian incursions. Did Maximinus ever eat flamingo tongues? Almost certainly not. Such delicacies required the kind of elaborate kitchen staff and cultural pretension he neither possessed nor desired. But in Rome, at senatorial banquets, wealthy diners ate them while discussing the barbaric emperor who'd never even visited the capital, seemingly unaware of the irony. The third year of his reign, 237, brought increasing difficulties. Germanic tribes, sensing Roman disunity, pressed harder against the frontiers. Maximinus led his legions deep into barbarian territory, burning villages, taking slaves, pushing the invaders back through sheer relentless force. The campaigns were successful militarily but exhausting, and the soldiers began to grumble despite their doubled pay. Being well compensated doesn't make you bulletproof, doesn't make winters less cold or marches less grueling. And then whispers began, dangerous whispers that traveled from Rome to the camps, from camp to camp, spreading like fever. The Senate had had enough. Wealthy provinces had had enough. There was talk of rebellion, of naming a rival emperor, of civil war. Maximinus heard these whispers and responded with characteristic directness. Threats, purges, executions. Anyone suspected of disloyalty faced immediate death. Paranoia began to replace the straightforward military competence that had defined his early reign. I want you to imagine a particular night during this period, a night that might have been typical of many. Maximinus in his command tent, oil lamps burning low, reports piled on a table that had belonged to previous emperors. The weight of his decisions pressing down like armor that can't be removed. Outside, sentries pacing, wind rustling through camp, the sounds of an army at rest. He was emperor of Rome but had never walked its streets, had never sacrificed in its temples, had never slept in the palace that was supposedly his home. Did he feel that absence? Did some part of him regret the path that led here, or was he too practical for such reflections? Allow your thoughts to drift now, to soften at the edges like shadows at dusk. The story grows darker ahead, but for this moment, let yourself simply be present with the sound of my voice, with the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. As your body settles more deeply into comfort, let the story carry you forward into the consequences that ambition and power inevitably bring. There's something almost inevitable about what happened next, a kind of historical gravity that pulls tyrants toward their doom. It began in North Africa, in the wealthy province of Africa Proconsularis, where olive groves stretched to the horizon and grain ships departed for Rome in an endless convoy. The year was 238, and Maximinus had been emperor for 3 years without ever setting foot in the capital. That absence was about to cost him everything. Let me tell you about the man who first challenged him. Gordian, Marcus Antonius Gordianus, governor of Africa, 80 years old if he was a day, from one of Rome's most distinguished families. Picture him, white-haired and dignified, a man who'd served Rome faithfully for decades, who'd never expected to become emperor, who probably would have preferred to retire to a villa somewhere and spend his remaining years reading philosophy. But history had other plans. The story goes that Gordian was essentially forced into rebellion by his own subjects. The people of Carthage, tired of Maximinus's brutal tax collectors, rose up and massacred the officials sent to extract wealth from their province. Then, in that peculiar panic that accompanies unplanned revolution, they realized they'd committed an act punishable by death and needed legitimacy fast. They turned to Gordian, acclaimed him emperor, gave him no real choice in the matter. He accepted, perhaps understanding that refusal meant death anyway, and immediately made his son, Gordian II, his co-emperor. Now, let me share with you something about the food culture of Carthage in this period, because it tells us so much about the wealth Maximinus was trying to extract. Carthage was famous for its garum production, that fermented fish sauce I mentioned earlier. The facilities along the coast processed tons of fish annually, mostly mackerel and anchovies, salted and left to ferment in large vats for months. The smell must have been incredible, powerful enough to notice from miles away, but the resulting sauce was liquid gold. Premium Carthaginian garum cost up to 15 denarii per pint in 238, and every ship bound for Rome carried amphorae of it in their holds. The people of Carthage also enjoyed the sweet dates from oases in the interior, shipped to coastal markets in great camel caravans. These weren't the tough dried dates we might find today, but fresh ones, plump and impossibly sweet, harvested at peak ripeness and consumed within days. The finest varieties, like the ajwa dates from specific palm groves, could cost a denarius for just a handful, luxury items that aristocrats served at dinner parties to impress their guests. In 238, date consumption in Carthage was so high that import records show thousands of tons arriving annually. But I digress into pleasanter topics than the grim reality of what happened next. Gordian I and Gordian II sent word to Rome, and the Senate, seeing its chance, immediately recognized them as legitimate emperors and declared Maximinus a public enemy. It was a death sentence in reverse, the empire officially disowning the man who controlled most of its armies. The senators must have felt both exhilarated and terrified, knowing Maximinus would respond with violence but unable to continue under his increasingly chaotic rule. Maximinus was in Pannonia when news reached him, preparing for another Germanic campaign. His reaction was reportedly volcanic, the kind of rage only a very powerful man can indulge. He immediately began marching his legions toward Italy, toward Rome, intending to crush this rebellion personally. It was a march that would take months, moving through hostile territory, across the Alps, down through the Po Valley toward the capital he'd never seen. Meanwhile, the situation in Africa collapsed with terrible speed. Gordian II died in battle against forces loyal to Maximinus, killed within weeks of his acclamation. His elderly father, Gordian I, received the news and hanged himself, unable to bear the grief and the certainty of Maximinus's revenge. Their rebellion lasted approximately 3 weeks, one of the shortest reigns in Roman history, and their deaths left the Senate in a desperately vulnerable position. They'd committed to opposing Maximinus, but their champions were already dead. In panic, the Senate appointed 2 new emperors jointly, Pupienus and Balbinus, respected senators who supposedly would rule together in harmony. They also, in a stroke of political genius or desperation, elevated Gordian I's 13-year-old grandson as Caesar, giving him the name Gordian III. This gave continuity to the rebellion, honoring the family that had first challenged Maximinus while placing actual governing power in more experienced hands. Let me tell you about an unusual food custom that supposedly took place during this chaotic period. To seal political alliances, Roman aristocrats would exchange gifts of preserved lamprey, those eel-like fish that wealthy Romans kept in private ponds and fed with slave meat, or so the gruesome rumors claimed. Whether the rumors were true or not, lampreys were certainly expensive delicacies, and preserved specimens packed in salt and spices could last for months, making them suitable diplomatic gifts. A single large lamprey might cost 20 denarii in 238, and sending a barrel of them represented both wealth and a slightly sinister message about what happens to enemies. The Senate sent such gifts to provincial governors, quietly soliciting their support against Maximinus. Now Maximinus was marching on Italy with loyal legions, and the Senate prepared Rome's defenses for the first time in generations. The city's walls were repaired, militia units formed from urban residents, grain reserves stockpiled. But the real defense would happen at Aquileia, the great fortress city at the head of the Adriatic, guardian of the routes into Italy. If Aquileia held, Maximinus would be stalled. If it fell, Rome would be defenseless. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. Aquileia was famous for its amber trade, the fossilized resin that came from Baltic shores and was carved into jewelry and decorative objects. In 238, amber cost about 3 denarii per ounce for common quality, but exceptional pieces with insects preserved inside could fetch 100 denarii or more. The shops of Aquileia glowed with amber in every shade from pale honey to deep crimson, and wealthy women across the empire treasured aquiline amber necklaces. This beautiful, prosperous city was about to become a battlefield. Maximinus arrived with his armies and laid siege, expecting quick victory. But Aquileia refused to surrender, its walls held, and spring rains turned the siege lines into muddy nightmares. Weeks passed, then months. Supply lines stretched thin. Soldiers grew hungry, sick, demoralized. The doubled pay didn't matter if there was nothing to buy with it, and camp rations grew increasingly meager as supply wagons failed to arrive. Imagine those nights outside Aquileia's walls, rain drumming on leather tents, men shivering in inadequate clothing, grumbling about the endless siege. Maximinus had led them to victory after victory, but now they were stuck in the mud, starving, while a city they couldn't take mocked them from behind stone walls. Loyalty is a fragile thing, easily broken by empty stomachs and lost faith. Allow your breathing to deepen now, to slow, as we approach the climax of this tragic story. The night is quiet around you, safe and warm, far removed from those desperate siege lines and the violence that's coming. Let yourself sink deeper into comfort as the story carries you toward its inevitable conclusion. The end came in May of 238, though Maximinus didn't know it was the end until those final terrible moments. Let me share with you how it happened, how an emperor who'd survived countless battles and seized the throne through force met his doom in a muddy military camp outside a city he couldn't conquer. Picture the scene with me. 2 months into the siege of Aquileia, supplies nearly exhausted, soldiers restless and hungry. The spring campaign season was passing, other frontiers were undefended, and the army that had loved Maximinus was starting to question whether following him was worth the cost. Grumbling turned to conspiracy, whispers became plans, and on a particular evening in May, a group of officers made their decision. Let me tell you about what Maximinus might have eaten that last evening of his life, if he ate anything at all. The siege rations had been reduced to the absolute minimum. Hard bread that was more sawdust than wheat, a thin pottage made from whatever grain remained, no oil, no meat, barely enough to keep body and soul together. This was the same food his soldiers were eating, and Maximinus had always insisted on sharing their privations. It was one of his virtues, that refusal to claim privileges his men lacked, but it meant he was just as hungry, just as worn down by the endless siege. There would have been no honey cakes now, no roasted meat, none of the plenty that had characterized earlier campaigns when supply lines functioned properly. Perhaps there was still garum, small amounts hoarded by officers, used to make the terrible bread marginally more palatable. That fish sauce that had once been plentiful was now precious, rationed like gold, a reminder of how far their circumstances had fallen. The conspirators chose their moment carefully. Late afternoon, when Maximinus was in his tent with his son, both of them were exhausted from another day of failed assaults on Aquileia's walls. The giant emperor who'd never been defeated in personal combat didn't hear them coming, or perhaps he heard but was too tired to react quickly enough. They rushed into the tent, swords drawn, and cut him down along with his son, the boy who'd been made Caesar and promised an empire. The ancient sources give us different details about exactly how it happened, whether Maximinus fought back, whether he cursed them or accepted his fate with stoic dignity. But the result was the same. The emperor who'd risen from shepherd to Augustus, who'd never seen Rome, who'd ruled through military force and died by it, was dead at 65 years old, his reign lasting barely 3 years. You might find this detail both soothingly interesting and deeply sad. After killing Maximinus, the soldiers cut off his head and paraded it on a spear through the camp. This wasn't unusual for the period. Roman military revolts often involved decapitating the former leader as proof of the regime change and deterrent to anyone who might remain loyal. Maximinus's enormous head, that face that had struck fear into Germanic tribesmen and inspired loyalty in Roman soldiers, reduced to a trophy and warning. The siege of Aquileia was immediately lifted. The armies that had followed Maximinus to Italy now swore loyalty to the Senate's emperors, Pupienus and Balbinus, hoping for pardons and back pay. Aquileia opened its gates, and the soldiers who tried to conquer it were now welcomed as liberators, a strange reversal that must have felt surreal to everyone involved. Let me tell you about the feast that supposedly followed in Aquileia, the celebration of the siege's end and the return of peace. The city's granaries were opened, and food that had been hoarded during the siege was distributed. There was fresh bread, the first the soldiers had eaten in weeks, baked from fine wheat flour and still warm from the ovens. There was roasted pork, whole pigs turned on spits over open fires, the smell of cooking meat driving men nearly mad with hunger after so long on starvation rations. And there was wine, rivers of it, dispensed freely to soldiers who drank themselves into oblivion, trying to forget the siege, the rebellion, the emperor they'd murdered. The sweet dishes included cakes made with honey and poppy seeds, traditional celebration foods that marked joyous occasions across the Roman world. Honey cost about the same as it had earlier, 1 denarius per pint for common quality, but after months of none at all it must have tasted like the nectar of the gods. Poppy seeds were cheaper, perhaps 10 as per pound in 238, but they added a pleasant nutty flavor and slight psychoactive effect that made the cakes even more festive. There was also fresh fruit, cherries, and early apples from local orchards, produce that would have been unavailable during the siege. The Romans loved cherries, which had been introduced to Italy by the general Lucullus centuries earlier after his campaigns in Asia Minor. By 238, cherry cultivation was widespread, and the fruit cost perhaps 1 as per pound when in season. Soldiers bit into them gratefully, the tart sweetness exploding on tongues that had known only bland grain for too long. But among all this celebration, there was also unease. The men had killed their emperor, broken the most sacred oath a soldier could swear. Yes, Maximinus had been failing them, had led them into disaster at Aquileia, but he'd also been their commander, their Augustus, chosen by them and crowned by their shields. The psychological weight of that betrayal must have been crushing, even as they justified it as necessary, as self-preservation, as the only rational choice. Maximinus's body was buried hastily in a shallow grave somewhere near the siege lines, unmarked, unmourned except perhaps by a few who'd served with him since the beginning. His son was buried nearby, 2 graves in alien soil, far from the Thracian hills where the story had begun decades earlier. There was no state funeral, no eulogies in the Senate, no monuments erected to his memory. He was declared damnatio memoriae, memory condemned, his name to be erased from inscriptions, his image destroyed, his entire existence officially forgotten. But memory is harder to erase than the Senate imagined. The soldiers remembered him, told stories around campfires of the giant emperor who'd been one of them, who'd understood military life because he'd lived it. And we remember him still, more than 17 centuries later, this man who reached the pinnacle of power and found it wasn't enough, who wore the purple but never felt comfortable in it, who died because he couldn't adapt to circumstances beyond pure military force. Let your mind rest now on this image. A spring evening in northern Italy, the siege ended, soldiers feasting and drinking, trying to feel joy but haunted by what they'd done. Somewhere nearby, 2 fresh graves, and in those graves, the remains of dreams and ambitions that had reached too high. Allow yourself to feel the gentle sadness of it, the waste and tragedy, as the story carries you toward its final chapter. So what do we make of Maximinus Thrax, this giant who ruled Rome without ever seeing it, who seized power through military force and lost it the same way? What were those secret nights really like? Those hours when the emperor was just a man, alone with his thoughts and his appetites, his pleasures and his fears. Let me share with you some final reflections as our story comes to its gentle close. The title of our journey spoke of power, pleasure, and corruption, and we've seen all 3 woven through Maximinus's brief reign. The power was undeniable, the absolute authority that came from commanding legions, from wearing the purple, from being able to order executions or confiscate estates with a word. But it was also precarious power, dependent on military loyalty that could evaporate like morning dew under the wrong circumstances. The pleasure, I think, was more complicated than the Roman sources acknowledged. They wanted to paint him as a barbarian glutton, consuming impossible quantities of food and wine, indulging every base appetite. But the real pleasures of his life were probably simpler and more human. The satisfaction of a battle won. The respect of soldiers who'd followed him for decades. The warmth of campfires and companionship. The touch of his wife, about whom we know so little but who must have been his anchor through all the chaos. The pride he felt watching his son grow into young manhood and military competence. These are ordinary pleasures, the kind anyone might treasure, and they meant more because they were earned rather than inherited. And the corruption? Is that too? The increasing paranoia that led to purges and executions. The confiscation of senatorial estates to fund military bonuses. The sacrilegious stripping of temples to mint more coins. The willingness to let provinces suffer under brutal tax collectors as long as the armies were paid. Power corrupts not because it transforms people into monsters, but because it makes cruelty efficient and removes the normal constraints that keep violence in check. Let me tell you about one final food detail, a curious footnote to our story. After Maximinus's death, there was a brief period of stability under Pupienus and Balbinus, but it lasted only months before they too were murdered, victims of the Praetorian Guard's displeasure. Young Gordian III, that 13-year-old grandson of the first Gordian, became sole emperor and ruled surprisingly well for 6 years with the help of capable advisors. During his reign, there was an attempt to restore normalcy to Roman dining customs, a conscious effort to return to traditional foods and reject the exotic excesses that had marked recent decades. One dish that became popular during Gordian III's reign was a simple porridge of emmer wheat and chickpeas, flavored with just a bit of olive oil and salt, deliberately modest to signal governmental restraint and connection to Rome's humble origins. Emmer wheat, one of the most ancient grains, cost about half what refined wheat flour cost. Perhaps 20 denarii for a modius, roughly 9 kilograms, in 240. Chickpeas were even cheaper, about 15 denarii per modius. It was peasant food, deliberately chosen to contrast with the perceived excesses of recent emperors, though whether Gordian III actually ate such humble fare or just encouraged others to is unclear. But this attempted return to simplicity didn't change the fundamental reality. The empire was in crisis, the military had tasted power and wouldn't easily relinquish it, and the 3rd century would see emperor after emperor rise and fall in rapid succession. Maximinus's reign was just one chapter in a longer story of Roman decline, though he didn't know it at the time. I want you to imagine one more scene with me, a secret night that never happened but might have, in a different world. Maximinus finally entered Rome, not as a conqueror but as a welcomed emperor. Walking the streets he'd only heard described, seeing the monuments whose images appeared on coins. Ascending the Palatine Hill to the Imperial Palace, standing in the throne room where Augustus had once stood, where Marcus Aurelius had contemplated philosophy, feeling connected to that long chain of emperors stretching back centuries. On this imagined night, there's a state banquet. Not the military camp meals he'd known, but a proper imperial feast with all the traditional dishes. The appetizers of salted fish and pickled vegetables. The main courses are roasted lamb with cumin, baked fish in herb sauce, vegetables dressed with olive oil. The sweet dishes of honey cakes and stewed fruit. Moderate quantities, properly prepared, served on fine tableware to carefully chosen guests. The Senate reconciled, the provinces prospering, the frontiers secure. Maximinus aging into respected authority, his son prepared to inherit peacefully. A dream, nothing more, but dreams matter sometimes. The reality was muddy death outside Aquileia's walls, a shallow grave, and official erasure. But even in that grim ending, there's something to contemplate. Maximinus lived large, rose impossibly high from impossibly low origins, commanded armies and provinces, made history even if history tried to forget him. His secret knights, whatever pleasures or corruptions they held, were his own, lived fully according to his nature. There's a kind of integrity in that, even in failure. You might find this final detail worth carrying into sleep with you. Archaeologists believe they may have found Maximinus's actual burial site in 2017, excavating near Aquileia and discovering a grave containing the bones of an unusually large man from the right period. The skeleton showed evidence of violence, sword cuts to the bones, consistent with assassination. If it truly is Maximinus, then his bones rested unknown and undisturbed for nearly 18 centuries, his secret finally uncovered by modern science. The night is deep now, and our story has reached its end. Maximinus Thrax, emperor for 3 years, lived for 65, remembered for 17 centuries and counting. Not a good emperor, perhaps, but a fascinating one, a human one, with all the complexity that implies. His secret nights are silent now, but we've walked through them together, imagining the man behind the purple, the person beneath the imperial dignity. Thank you for traveling through this gentle piece of history with me. I hope the story has helped you unwind, has given your mind something to contemplate as sleep approaches, has made the distant past feel momentarily present and real. If you drifted into peaceful sleep somewhere along the way, I hope the dreams were kind. And if you're still with me now, feeling drowsy and content, let yourself sink into that comfort. The emperors are all gone, their palaces ruined, their armies dust. But the stories remain, whispers from the past that connect us to people who lived and loved and struggled just as we do, just in different clothes, different languages, different centuries. Sleep well, friends. If this journey helped you unwind, let me know in the comments below. Sweet dreams, and may your secret nights be filled with peace rather than the weight of empires. Rest now. The story is complete. The fire has burned to embers, and the darkness is soft and welcoming. Close your eyes and drift away into whatever dreams await you. Good night.